Welcome to the Future Media Podcast. I'm Ricky Sutton.
And I'm Alan Chappell. And this podcast goes deep into the collision of big tech
and the future of the world.
We explore how companies like Google, Meta, and Apple are impacting each of our lives.
I'm an investigative journalist.
I'm a privacy lawyer.
And every week we speak with experts to bring the unreported details into the light.
Hello there. Rod Sims was one of the first regulators to drag Google and Meta to the bargaining table to make them pay for news. In 2021, the News Media Bargaining Code that he crafted in Australia became a world first. And for the next 3 years, Google and Meta pumped roughly $250 million a year into around 30 Australian newsrooms. But it only happened after a bare-knuckle fight. Google went public, threatening to pull its search engine out of Australia, and Facebook hit the nuclear button and blocked news, albeit ham-fistedly, taking health and emergency information offline for millions of Australians by accident. But the code, designed under Rod's watch at the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, had teeth. It included a clause taken from American baseball that meant that if the tech giants refused to pay or negotiate fairly and walked away, an arbiter could simply pick a number out of a hat. And some of the numbers being talked about were enormous. In the end, Google and Meta stayed and they paid. But 3 years later, at the first renewal, Meta walked away from the deal. Google kept paying, but its new agreements were for 1 year and more fragile, making the newsrooms very nervy. Now, Australia has a new government and it's trying to close the loopholes with a new idea, the News Media Initiative. It's basically a tax levy on big platforms that earn more than $250 million a year in revenue here, unless they strike fair deals with news outlets. The premise is simple. Pay the publishers, or we'll tax your earnings and you can pay the taxman instead. But at the same time, the world-class competition commission that Rod helped build is facing cutbacks and job cuts, and there's an awful lot going on. But more often than not, Australia is the canary in the coal mine, the first to give it a go. Canada took its inspiration from Australia's lead, so did Europe. South Africa's just finished its own landmark inquiry, forcing Google and Meta and others to fund media. And layered over all of this is the new and ever-pressing fight about how journalism remains funded in an AI future. Now, Rod's left the ACCC now, but his blueprint and his thinking still shapes how the rest of the world acts on getting big tech and platforms to pay for news. And he joins us today. So Rod, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Very well indeed, Ricky. Nice to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you on. I said to you once that everywhere I go in the world, and I travel a lot, people ask me about the News Media Bargaining Code. They ask me about Australia. It's viewed as the kind of tip of the iceberg of the work that was ever done. And your name comes up again and again and again. And it was a giant piece of work. We're a few years on now. Do you think it was a success? Are you really happy with it?
Yes, I am, Ricky. We had an objective of getting private deals done between publishers and the platforms, and we achieved that. $250 million a year was about what I estimated, probably slightly more than I hoped we'd get. And I think just about everybody who, under the legislation, was supposed to get a deal, got a deal. So if that was our objective, I think we achieved it. So very successful.
So let's just go back in time just a little bit to that period, because the world's moved on a long way. But back then, these publishers weren't being paid anything by the platforms, really, were they, other than advertising? So where did this come from? What was the goal?
It came from an inquiry that the previous government asked us to do on the platforms very broadly. And if I could just segue slightly, I mean, various competition regulators had been taking cases against the platforms, the European Commission mainly, and they'd been successful, but they got large fines. So because they were cases, they narrowed down to a particular outcome that is narrow. And so it wasn't changing behaviour. So the idea was that we would do a wide-ranging inquiry to actually find out what's going on. And I think it was the first major inquiry or first inquiry into the digital platforms. And it unearthed a whole range of issues. I mean, one that I always found interesting was that, yes, platforms do have market power. That might seem obvious, but that finding resonated, frankly, around the world. And we looked at competition, consumer, privacy, and media issues. So there were 23 recommendations. One of those was to have a news media bargaining code, because once we got into the whole area, and you only saw this once you had this detailed inquiry that looked at everything, it was clear that this was really, what was happening was really damaging the media, that the platforms weren't producing media content. They were actually taking it from people who were using it to benefit their systems, because it was providing good news that kept people on the platforms, and so allowed them to sell advertising against it. And yet the news organizations themselves weren't really getting any benefit from that. So they were losing their content and not getting rewarded for it, which is obviously unsustainable.
Yeah. And how many people did you have involved in that inquiry? Because that sounds like a fairly significant piece of work.
Look, I think we probably had about 30 people floated in and out, lawyers, economists, as well as the digital platform team, but about 30.
Okay. And did the publishers all align to help with this inquiry? Because often it's hard to get publishers to work collectively. They're kind of like herding cats. Did they all come on board straight away? Were they skeptical? I mean, what was their reaction?
Google, skeptical, helped a bit. Facebook, no engagement. So under our law, we have compulsory information gathering powers when the government asks us to do one of these inquiries. So we sent them a whole range of notices to find out what they do, how they do things, and really understand their business model and their business system very well. So in that sense, Ricky, we didn't need their cooperation. We could use compulsory information notices. I mean, if you don't comply with those, that's actually a breach of the law, and there are serious consequences.
What about the publishers, though? Did the publishers all join in? Because they're famous for being skeptical that these things are ever going to work in their favor. Did they engage with you?
It was interesting, Ricky. They did, and they did collectively. I mean, obviously we get information from them individually, but it was very interesting that the media came together. So we had, to use the classic example, which I enjoy, News Limited and Guardian on the one page trying to get this done. I don't think there's any other arena in which those two would cooperate, but they did on this. And so we've got, a range of media companies. Probably the four biggest are News 9, which owns the Melbourne and Sydney broadsheets and the Financial Review. 7, which owns the major television stations, a lot of papers in Western Australia, and of course the ABC, the government-owned Broadcasting Commission. But the Guardian, as a new digital native, is also right up there in terms of people accessing their content online. So all of those cooperated, and a range of other smaller ones cooperated as well. So
the majority of the publishers that I talk to domestically and globally have very nice things to say about you. They, they appreciate you had a first go. They think you're a real tough cookie. Is that the kind of way you see yourself?
Oh, in the right place at the right time, I think, Ricky. We were fortunate enough to be asked to do that inquiry. It's an inquiry we were hoping we'd be asked to do, so there was a lot of work going on there. And then having the team in place, excellent team. So right place, right time, I think. But, very determined to get this done.
So lots of people are now going into negotiations. I think I shared with you some documentation just the other day on stuff going on in South Africa, which is interesting, which is another market I know quite well. It's always very difficult to know which platform behavior you're going to get when you put them under pressure. They can be incredibly charming, they can be incredibly nice, but they can also be incredibly tough and incredibly difficult. Your experience with them, you mentioned earlier on that Google kind of came to the party, Meta didn't. Can you explain a little bit more about that and how that kind of manifested?
I think the Google culture is to have very close, warm engagement, and they certainly did. They put forward various options for change, which were, I think, reasonable from their point of view. They were trying to put something forward that would work. In the end, it wasn't enough, and so we pressed ahead with the bargaining code. Facebook, fairly early on, said this has got nothing to do with us. We don't want anything to do with this. And after a bit of early engagement, broke off that engagement. So very different corporate approaches. Facebook were always angry, hard to deal with, and as I say, in the end, broke off the engagement. Google stayed engaged right throughout the period.
For you as the regulator, you've regulated lots of different difficult industries, monopolies, if you like, prior to this. How did they compare in terms of their engagement? Were they different to perhaps banking or other organizations of scale that you'd worked with?
Oh, they were, because they were getting regulated, I guess, for the first time. Whereas banks have got financial regulation, telecommunications have got their own regulation. They're used to that. So that's why I think Google did approach this in a very positive way. Facebook were just stunned that anybody would want to regulate them in any way. So, yeah, it was a bit different, but I hope that Rubicon's now been crossed and that they will become more used to regulation, because they have to, given the role they play in society. And, of course, it's only going to be beefed up enormously with AI.
So you delivered a solution that paid publishers around $250 million a year for, I think, 3 years. And then at the end of that 3 years, Meta pulled out and said, we're taking our toys, we're going home. Were you surprised when that happened?
Well, to be clear, Google deals with 5 years.
That's right.
And they run out mid next year, largely. Facebook's were, or Meta's deals, but it was Facebook really, were 3 years. They were signalling in all sorts of ways, mainly overseas. You know, you were following comments made in America that they would not do these sort of deals and that this was the end of it. So when they pulled out, no, it was no longer a surprise. And of course, the Canadians tried to implement a code, and Facebook just would not. Whereas Google engaged, Facebook just would not. And to avoid it, they took down all media content from their platform. So we knew where Facebook was coming from before they didn't renew the deals.
So under the News Media Bargaining Code, there was a clause in place to designate those platforms if they did something like that. Can you explain what that was and what it meant, please?
Yes, under the law, so the News Media Bargaining Code is the law of the land. To trigger it, it requires the Treasurer of Australia to designate a platform. Once designated, you're required to negotiate deals with media companies, all media companies. You can't pick some, all. And then if you can't agree, it goes to arbitration, which is, to use the term, a baseball arbitration, where the arbitrator can choose one side's bid or the other side's bid, but can't combine them, has to pick one or the other. And that hopefully drives sensible bids. What happened in Australia is that Facebook took down news and said, that's what we're going to do if you keep going with this law. Google threatened to withdraw Google services from Australia. In the end, they both backed down. Google, partly because Microsoft said straight away that we'll boost up Bing in Australia and have it take the place of Google.
I think that's interesting. I'll come back to that.
And Facebook overplayed their hand and took down all sorts of content about bushfires and medical advice and a whole range of things that caused outrage in the community. So with that pushback to both of them, the Treasurer negotiated an arrangement where he said, look, I won't designate you if you go out and do deals quickly. Well, they did that. I think they did that. They wanted it that way so they could go around the world and say they were never covered by the News Media Bargaining Code, that what they did was voluntary. But obviously it wasn't voluntary. The threat was designation. But they went out and immediately did deals. So from our point of view, we got a lot of deals done much faster than we would have ever got them done. So we were very pleased with that outcome. So they weren't designated because they did deals. But of course, the code still exists, and Google particularly could still be designated to keep the deals flowing, or threatened to designate to keep the deals going.
What about Meta, though? Meta has ended the deal, and it hasn't been designated. If it's not too political a question for you, what are your thoughts on that? Why haven't they been designated when the law exists for just that purpose?
Yeah, look, the government's been thinking hard what to do, I guess. So the government could just say to Google, you continue under the News Media Bargaining Code. After all, Google was 70% of that 250 million. So as far as the publishers are concerned, that's a big lot of money continuing. So the News Media Bargaining Code as is could keep going on just with Google. But the problem with the News Media Bargaining Code, which I guess perhaps we didn't realise at the time, is it says you're only covered by this if you show news. Facebook has said we won't show news in Canada. They've threatened to do the same here if they're designated. So if they did that, they wouldn't be covered. So designation would be useless. And what they've done in Canada shows that's exactly what they would do. So no point designating them. They'll just take news off their platform. So the government's been working out what to do and how to respond to that. Does it just continue the code with Google, or does it come up with something different that picks up Facebook and, by the way, TikTok and a few others?
Yeah.
What the government's decided to do, and it said it a year ago, but has brought out a paper a couple of weeks ago. I think it's the News Media Initiative or News Bargaining Initiative. I'm not sure, one of the two.
Incentive.
And what that does. Sorry.
Incentive. Yes. Yep.
Oh, an incentive, News Media Incentive. And what that does is says you either do deals or we're going to require you to pay a certain amount of money, call it a tax if you like, or a levy, and then we will take that money and distribute it to media. Now, that's not something, to be very clear, that's not something we could have done up front, right? Because we didn't know what the payments were going to be. Mm-hmm. Now we know what the payments are. We know what's been paid to each media organisation. So the government can actually do that. It can say, this is the levy you've got to pay, and we'll distribute it. Now, what the government's done is pitch the levy at an amount above what they're paying now. So the government doesn't want to collect the levy. It wants to get them working back under the News Media Bargaining Code. So it's a forcing device to do that. We'll see how it plays out, Ricky. But it's a good move by the government. I mean, I'm very strongly supportive of what the government's done.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. You like it. So it's kind of designed to be an incentive on the basis that we'll charge you more money in tax than you'll pay if you pay the publisher. Therefore, it's an incentive to pay the publisher, correct? Is that shorthand?
No, that's exactly right. Well, to pay the publishers through privately negotiated deals, that's the crucial bit. So the deals that were done, and I was obviously not involved in any of them, that would be inappropriate, but I was just chatting to some of the deal makers at various times, and the deals were going on for quite some time. So they were detailed deals, bespoke to each publisher. Therefore, in terms of what the publishers got and what the platforms gave up, they were sort of optimal deals. And so it wasn't just a payment. It was all sorts of things, which I think are valuable. So what we want is negotiated deals with each publisher. Yes, we've got a great benchmark under the code for both what Google can do and Meta can do. And of course, if we bring in TikTok and Apple News, say, we've got a rough benchmark of what they should be providing as well. I say I'm out of it now.
But you still feel some ownership of it because you've done so much.
Still feel committed in that way, but your audience should understand I'm out of it now.
So you've just mentioned a couple of things there. there are now more platforms than Google and Meta. So I noticed this came up a lot in the South African decision just the other day on its policy, and it also came up in the antitrust trials. So now you've got TikTok, is a very significant mover and shaker in the market, Apple News. So these people are now emerging. Do you think they should all be involved in this? Should they all now be brought into this group that must negotiate or think about the initiative?
Oh, two things, if I could, to that, Ricky. Yes, they should, because if you're going to do this, then it should apply equally without favouring one lot or the other. And so you want the platforms to have news on their platform. When I say news, written by journalists who know what they're doing, which is quite different to posting a blog or putting an article on Substack, which anybody can do. No, these are news stories written by journalists, and that's what matters. So yes, they should, but of course, and you may well get to this later on, the same issue arises with AI, so artificial intelligence. So we've got more organisations that should be caught in the net, I think, as well.
Yeah, and so the new law, the incentive includes that capability, because I think it says anybody that generates $250 million or above in Australia qualifies into this category. I've got that right, haven't I?
Yes.
Right. Okay, can I ask you a different question? So here's a question I got asked just last week, and you've been very generous with your time with me recently, and I'd never had this question to ask you before, but I want to ask you today. Somebody said to me, Ricky, we're going into a negotiation. This is very tricky and meaningful and almost existential for us. What should we be looking at? What are the benchmarks? What kind of numbers and percentages and what things should we be asking for? They were asking for a blueprint for a deal structure. Now, my understanding is that under the terms of the deals, and you've just alluded to this, the deals that were done were all private once you'd brought the negotiations together. Once that happened, it was all behind closed doors. Is that what you think should happen from a competition perspective? Or should there be a general blueprint that people can build on? Because not everybody has a great negotiating team, or maybe not even as much leverage as a larger publisher. So what are your thoughts on that? Should it be secret or should it be revealed?
We wanted them secret because they were private commercial deals. We were trying to replicate what would happen in a normal marketplace. So we've got a deal between the ABC or the Guardian on one side and Google, Facebook, or whoever on the other side. That's a deal that should have been happening anyway, and we're trying to replicate that market. But I understand the blueprint point. But keep in mind the way the bargaining code was structured. And my one concern with the News Media Initiative is that the News Media Bargaining Code said you had to do a deal with everybody. So everybody had leverage. They couldn't just do a deal with the 5 or 6 major players. They had to do a deal with everybody. So, for example, Country Press Australia, which I think has about 180 publications owned by 60 players, or 160 publications owned by 80.
Yeah.
Very, very small. I mean, these are really, really small newspapers, but they collectively bargained, which is allowed under Australian law.
Yes, important.
And of course, that's right. That is really important. That is automatically allowed under Australian law. And so they got a very good deal. I think dollars per journalist, they probably got the best deal of anybody, because it had to be done. And because, I did go out and say publicly many, many times that, of course, you can't not do a deal with Country Press Australia. I mean, they're out there in most regions of Australia. So I think that leverage comes from you must do a deal with everybody. That's the important part. Now, to go to your point about blueprint, look, I get that. And I think there may now be a way. So I was comfortable with what we did before, but I get your blueprint point. So I think there may now be a way of having some aggregate information out there. I mean, you don't want to publish the contracts that were negotiated. That would be disastrous. But giving some idea of who got what would, I think, be useful to provide that benchmark. Now, how that's done, I don't know, but I'm very confident you could do it to provide that benchmark. A player of an unnamed you could list, say, 5 deals that were done of different revenue levels where you kept the names of the players anonymous, provided you pick your revenue levels. There's enough players at each level to do that. You could provide that blueprint, and I think probably that should be done.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. You said earlier on that the deal was designed for every publisher. Everybody gets to win, but there were some complaints, as I'm sure you're aware, from very small publishers, or smaller publishers, I should say, perhaps independent publishers that didn't feel they were included in that, and they lost out where perhaps the big guys won. How do you square that? And how do we cater for that in the future? Because we've seen some of the same things happening in Canada, where the big guys get all the attention and some of the smaller guys are further down the pecking order. How do we balance that, do you think?
I think we did balance it, Ricky, and it's really important. And I'll make, so let me make 2 points again. So the first point is the bargaining code said a deal had to be done with everybody who publishes, call it public interest news, public interest journalism. And you don't need to be all about that, but you need to be a bit about that. So there were some publishers, for example, that were, sports publications. So we took the view that, sorry, you're not showing public interest news. And so there were judgments to be made about who was in and who was out. Now, in my discussions with people close to the media, without a barrier, from what I could tell, without a barrier push, they felt that just about everybody who should have got a deal did get a deal. I mean, when you look at Country Press Australia, 160 or 180 publications, that's a lot. There was another collectively bargained group that include foreign language publishers, Chinese, Italian, Greek, Indian. They got a deal. So we weren't, it wasn't brought to my attention, at least, that there's someone out there who desperately, who clearly should have been in, who didn't get a deal. So I think they were marginal cases. Now, obviously, if you're in that category, you'd violently object to what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You'd say, of course, we publish news, but it was all about news. It wasn't about publishers. You had to be actually conveying news. Now, the second point, if I could, is the News Media Initiative has a clause in it that says you don't need to do deals with everybody, but you've got to do deals with sort of an even spread, and it caps the amount of a deal you can do with any one player to provide that even spread. So, you've got to be paying over this amount of money, and you can only pay this amount to the big players. So that, but I just don't know why they don't spread, and I'm going to be arguing very strongly that they should spread, they should use the same language as the News Media Bargaining Code. Everybody should be covered, and I don't think there's a problem with that, because ultimately that's what the law is saying. I don't think anybody can be held to ransom because you've got enough benchmarks. The government can, and you've got the arbitration process. I mean, that's the key point. If at the end of the day, someone's overplaying their hand, you can take it to arbitration. And the beauty of the baseball arbitration is that they can't go to the arbitrator with a ridiculous bid because the arbitrator will side with the other player. So that's my one criticism of the News Media Initiative. But no, you can get everybody in, and a lot of small players got deals.
All right. So my last question on the bargaining code, on the original bargaining code, is: do you think it was enough money?
It was slightly more than I calculated. You might ask, how did I do my calculation? It was pretty rough. It basically said how much are media publishers paying their journalists and their editorial staff, what is a reasonable percentage for the platforms to be covering. And I just worked out some benchmarks that said clearly covering 50% of their media costs was probably too much, covering 5% was too little, and settled somewhere in between. And lo and behold, the deals came to be about 25% of their journalism and editorial staff. And there's your benchmark, if you like, Ricky.
Okay. Yes, I see. Very good.
And I said that publicly too, which I think that helped guide the negotiations to a sensible place.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So the world's moved quite a long way on. We've now got AI, and you and I have spoken several times about this deal, but I do want to use your brain to cast forward to what we need to do next, because you have uncommon experience in negotiating these things. AI is clearly a game changer for us, okay? We now have a situation where content's being taken and used in search with no clicks coming back. So another part of the earning mechanism of the media industry is being dismantled. If you were sat in that chair again today and you were facing that AI challenge and you've got the incentive scheme in front of you, how would you be thinking about that, do you think?
Pretty much the same, only more strongly, Ricky. I think AI, ChatGPT has said it wants to be the home for everybody. All the apps would be on ChatGPT. You wouldn't have to leave the platform. And as you say, they give you an answer to a question without any links. Although I must say, my most recent search on an AI platform name actually did give me the links when I went to search, so that was interesting. Most times they don't, but on this occasion they did. I'm not quite sure why. But normally they're not. They're just summarizing, reaching out over everything and summarizing. And of course, if you want to know what's going on with the war in Ukraine, for example, with the recent proposals by Mr. Trump, his 28-point plan, you're going to go to the media, right? Because they're the only ones covering it. There's no learned academic articles up and about. It's the media. And there's so many issues like that. So I think the same thing applies. They're using people's content without payment to benefit their own service. And that just means we won't have any media anymore, except very large players behind paywalls where people subscribe to the payment. The easiest example to use is The Economist. Charges a lot of money, I know, because I pay it. And you'd think they'll be okay, and a few others will be okay, but most others won't, because their content is being taken for no payment, and so that's just not sustainable. So I think the same thing applies, and the same process could apply. I mean, it's not hard to do this. You've got how many of you want to put it, but say 3 or 4 big AI platforms, and they can be brought under the code in just the same way, and with the same process, either the News Media Bargaining Code or the News Media Initiative, whichever one you want to use. So I just think the template is already there, Ricky. It may need a bit of adjustment. I can't off the top of my head think what that adjustment should be, but there's no way in the world that they can exist without media content. So, I mean, what's interesting, Google, as we know, cannot exist without media content. You know, you can't have a search firm that doesn't rely on news. Facebook, once upon a time, had a news feed. As soon as we came along, they dropped the word news and turned it into feed. And they judge that they can get away with not giving their people news. Interesting, but that's the judgment they've made. But you can't have an AI platform without news. I mean, you just can't, because they're supposed to give you the answer to your queries. Now, some queries, like what's the price of I should be seeking to pay for a good pair of running shoes, if someone was to ask that, I don't know. Okay, you can get away with that. But most queries need news, because they've written stories on so many issues that AI will go to them. So I think even the News Media Bargaining Code would catch them as they are if they were designated or threatened to be designated under the code.
So the shorthand here I'm hearing from you is that you think that the AI companies should be involved in the future bargaining codes. Have to be.
I mean, they should be, because they're completely dependent on news for their service, and therefore they should pay for that. And if they're not covered, then media is threatened. And that, of course, once you threaten media, you threaten democracy. So it's a big issue.
Excellent point. I actually had this conversation this time last week with the head of Google News, who was there for years, a chap called Richard Gingras. I don't know if you ever came across him, but he is a very strong advocate for news verbally, but a very strong advocate, in being the boss of Google News, and fought quite a lot of fights. His argument was, all of our data shows that people don't care about the news. And in my response, I said to him, look, I think you have to ask the question about value. Value the news in data that sells advertising might be different to value the news because you need to know it. And so, if it's a pecuniary advantage, a monetary advantage you're seeking, your argument has sense. But in an argument where society, and you're trying to maintain people's knowledge and ability to vote and make good decisions, that's a different kind of value. Did you come up against that when you were working with the platforms? Did they have that strange disassociation that occurs there?
All the time. And so with Google, I mean, yes, of course, if you're doing a query about what's happening with the Russia-Ukraine war, you're not very likely to advertise against that search versus someone searching for running shoes. So I get that. But your whole service, the reason you get adherents to or users joining your platform is that they can ask about the Russian-Ukraine war and get that information. So it's essential to the full service. But yes, each item for item, they're probably not advertising against news. So I think it's a bogus argument. Now, the interesting thing, Ricky, which is that, if there were would Google care if there was no news on their, no public interest journalism shown on their platform? I think the answer is yes, if Bing and DuckDuckGo had public interest journalism and Google didn't. I think Google would lose out in that, and they would care about that. But if no if no search engine or no AI vehicle had public interest journalism, would they care about the damage that does to society? I don't know. But I think here is a role for government that you need. I mean, if these platforms are going to be as all-embracing as they want to be, then getting back to the logic of the News Media Initiative, I think you've got to say, look, you must carry journalism to have a properly functioning society. We want our AI vehicles or our search engines or our social media companies to be giving people access to good quality public interest journalism. And if they're not getting that, then society loses. So I think one entity wouldn't want to compete without it. If none of them had it, it's not clear to me they care. So I think there is a clear role for government here.
Rod, that's amazing. Thank you. So I really care about this issue. So if you want to be a broadcaster, you have rules about must carry. You must make a certain amount of educational content. You must make a certain amount of news content. You must make a certain amount of domestically produced childhood programming and so forth. That must carry has existed in broadcasting for decades, doesn't exist in digital. And so it feels to me that we do need public interest journalism almost as a must carry, which brings me back to a point you mentioned earlier on, which was the Microsoft Bing leaping up when Google said we'll leave. I thought that was fascinating because I genuinely see, so in the market today, Google in the antitrust trial, the data that was shared in the antitrust trial, it's slightly different now, but at the time, it was that Google controlled 91% of global search and Microsoft had spent $100 billion and achieved 3% share of search. And when they'd sought to get VC capital, this is Microsoft, had sought VC capital to compete, Satya Nadella described it as the biggest no-fly zone in Silicon Valley, right? No one would go anywhere near it because Google was so dominant, hence its monopoly, okay? So if they decide they're not going to play, suddenly Microsoft has an opportunity to take market share. So does DuckDuckGo, so does Ecosia. Is there, in your role or in your former role at the Competition Commission, was it the right thing for you to do to create competition and tension in those markets to try and get those people to do this? Was that another kind of side effect of the work that you were doing?
It was certainly the backdrop to the work we were doing, but the Google-Microsoft thing was fascinating. Google, it's an amazing story. Google threatened on a Friday to pull out of Australia if the legislation went through. the CEO of Google in Australia was delivering that news. She looked uncomfortable. We discovered the next day the reason she was uncomfortable is that she just had a baby on the Saturday morning after the Friday. So an amazing story there. But the CEO of Microsoft phoned the Australian Prime Minister the day after and said, we can provide that service. So yes, they saw this as an amazing opportunity to make inroads into that in Australia it's about 95%, or used to be, that over 90% of search. And that was something Google couldn't allow, because once they lost their dominant position in one market, it set a benchmark for other markets. So, but, the fact that the CEO called our Prime Minister the next day just indicated how important this issue was, and really Google, I think, had no option but to back down, which they did.
Competition, which is the whole point.
Look, absolutely. I mean, competition drives our market economy. If we don't have competition, we're in a dreadful place.
I literally wrote in the very, very first newsletter post I ever wrote on Substack about this, I said Microsoft has an opportunity here, and publishing has an opportunity to work with Microsoft, because if you can provide a benefit to Microsoft that gives it market share in search, it will come in behind you to support publishing. There's an opportunity here. I still think that exists. So I want to ask you about this, and this is my last question, unless you want to go anywhere. You have a situation, or we have a situation, where we have increasing numbers of competitors in the marketplace, the rise of AI. We have a bargaining code that is becoming an incentive. We have all manner of different moving parts happening within consumer preferences are changing, devices are changing, AI is changing everything. And they seem to be cutting jobs in the ACCC, in your former division. Surely this division is about to be the busiest it's ever been on something that literally has a fingerprint on our GDP. That feels an odd choice to do that now of all times.
I think the way these things work, Ricky, is that it's not so much a choice as governments provide budgets for set periods. In the case of us, the digital platforms branch, it was for 5 years, and that basically runs out at the end of December, in about a month's time. And so given that, the branch has just wound itself down. People have left. Some have gone elsewhere in the ACCC. Some have gone to work for the platforms or the AI companies, which, no surprise, they're well-qualified people. And some have just gone elsewhere. So it's not that the government made a decision, it's that they didn't make a decision. That's the problem. It's the inertia. It's the lack of, urgency in the issue. They've just sort of let it drift and brought about this situation. So I've tried to give put a bit of focus on this issue so the government will get moving and fix it so we can re-establish the unit. But there's no doubt we've lost something with those people going away, and that's a real shame.
Can it be recovered? Is this something that, can be rebuilt? It must have taken you a while to build it the first time.
Look, it can be rebuilt. It does take time, but not too much time. I mean, basically what we're getting here is a lot of younger people, 20s, 30s, who've grown up with the IT. I remember one time a daughter of one of my colleagues who was about 2 came into the office and she had her own iPad. Admittedly, it was an iPad for a 2-year-old, but so these people have grown up with platforms and social media, and they'll quickly adapt to AI. So what they basically did was use their knowledge to find out what the platforms do, partly through those information gathering notices, and partly by just throwing things at the algorithm and seeing what they got back. So what we'll need is people who have an affinity for the technology and people who are really smart. So look, they'll come back again. It'll just take a bit more time. But first of all, we need, Ricky, the government to make a decision to bring them back again. We need a decision that restores those 30 people. And I'm hoping over the next few months we get it.
Well, that was going to be my last question to you. It was going to be, what was your advice? But it sounds to me like your advice was, let's get those people back in because we need them now more than ever.
Well, it's in the lap of government, really. I mean, and I think it'll be an awful situation if government doesn't make that decision.
It's interesting. In the Meta ruling in the US, that a judge ruled that it didn't have a monopoly. Even though what the judge actually said was it did have a monopoly when this monopoly case was brought 5 years ago, but it's moved so fast that now it doesn't anymore. Okay. And so there's always going to be a challenge between the pace of government and the pace of the tech companies. The tech companies move fast and break things, and governments move slowly to fix things, right? Is that a natural tension that we've got?
Look, it is, but the way you address that is by having these ex-ante regulatory regimes, which they've now got in Europe, because Europe decided taking enforcement cases wasn't going to work. That enforcement cases meaning watch what they do, see when we think they've broken the law, take them to court, takes about a year to prepare for that, have a court case, and away we go. What we need is upfront regulation, which the EC brought in through the Digital Markets Act, which the UK's brought in through their special market status regime. It's got a slightly different name, but that's the essence of it, and which the ACCC recommended should apply in Australia well over 3 years ago. And so I'm hoping that the Australian government will adopt that regime and bring back the 30 people, or perhaps more, to run it. Then we'll be able to move as quickly as the platforms do. Just one point on the Facebook issue, and there's a slight difference here between Australia and the US on this as many other issues. But in Australia, it's all about having substantial market power. And 2 or 3 players can have substantial market power. It means you can price without much regard to reaction of competitors or reaction of users. So the US talks of monopoly. Now, monopoly usually means near 100%, and Google being over 90%. Yes, monopoly. But in Australia, you could have a 40 or 50% market share and be found to have substantial market power. So I think that situation wouldn't arise in Australian legal cases. But the bigger point is we have to have upfront regulation with people who are focused on the issue. I think they should sit within competition regulators. You don't want standalone regulators because they'll get captured and the regime won't work. You need them to exist in competition regulators, and that way they can go the journey and evolve as the platforms evolve and bring in place appropriate regulation as it's needed.
Amazing. Last thing, I promise. You said to me recently, there's a big difference between a regulator and an enforcer. And the tech companies love to talk about enforcers. We're working with the enforcement authorities on this. We've spoken to the enforcer and we have agreed to make these changes. Enforcer, but never a regulator. I actually went and did some checks. I had to look through some press releases. There's an awful lot of enforcers and not a lot of regulators in their documentation. Explain to me why there's a difference between a regulator and an enforcer and why the tech companies don't like regulators.
The difference is enforcers are enforcing the law once they see a breach. And you take a company to court. To win the court case, you've got to narrow down what they did wrong. You can't say, here's the problem. No, you've got to narrow it down to what they did wrong. Therefore, if you win the case, and you may not, and you get a ruling that they can't do that anymore, it's this they can't do, not this. Regulation tells them upfront what they can and can't do. And think about telecommunications. That's the obvious comparator. And we had this debate in Australia probably 30 years ago. Do we use competition law to regulate them, or do we have upfront regulation? And back then we chose regulation. And you've got it in Europe and you've got it in the United States, right? There's a whole agency set up to regulate telecommunications. That's regulation. So yes, many consider it to be a dirty word, but does anybody seriously think you'd stop regulating the telecommunications or the energy poles and wires and just leave it to enforcement? No, of course they don't. Everyone understands and roads. We've got rules of the roads. You've got to drive on a certain side of the road. You've got to stick to speed limits. That's regulation. So you need regulation to get proper behaviour in this sector. It's happening. I hope we have a regime to allow it to happen in Australia, but it's absolutely fundamental. And if you have that, you can react to fast-changing circumstances. So it's very important, Ricky.
Amazing. Rod, thank you so much. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your work. And thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Ricky. I enjoyed the chat.
Thanks for tuning in. The Future Media Podcast is a production of Future Media and Ricky Sutton.